Ghassan Kanafani. Returning to Haifa. Chapter 1. When he reached the edge of Haifa, approaching by car along the Jerusalem road, said S. had the sensation that something was binding his tongue, compelling him to keep silent, and he felt grief well up inside of him. 4. One moment he was tempted to turn back, and without even looking at her he knew that his wife had begun to cry silently. Then suddenly came the sound of the sea, exactly the way it used to be. Oh no, the memory did not return to him little by little. Instead, it rained down inside his head the way a stone wall collapses, the stones piling up, one upon another. The incidents and the events came to him suddenly and began to pile up and fill his entire being. He told himself that Sophia, his wife, felt exactly the same, and that was why she was crying. Ever since he left Ramallah that morning he had not stopped talking, nor had she. Beneath his gaze, the field sped by through the windshield, and the heat was unbearable. He felt his forehead catch fire, exactly like the burning asphalt beneath the car's wheels, while above him the sun, the terrible June sun, spilled the tar of its anger upon the earth. All along the way he talked and talked and talked. He spoke to his wife about everything, about the war and about the defeat, about the Mandelbaum Gate, demolished by bulldozers, and about the enemy, who reached the river, then the canal, then the edge of Damascus in a matter of hours. 1 And about the ceasefire, and the radio, and the way the soldiers plundered belongings and furniture, and the curfew, and his cousin in Kuwait consumed with anxiety, and the neighbor who gathered his things and fled, and the 3 Arab soldiers who fought alone for 2 days on the hill near Augusta Victoria Hospital, and the men who took off their army uniforms and fought in the streets of Jerusalem, and the peasant who was killed the minute they saw him near the largest hotel in Ramallah. His wife spoke of many other matters. Throughout the entire journey, neither of them stopped talking. Now, as they reached the entrance to Haifa, they both fell silent. At that moment they both realized that they had not spoken a word about the matter which had brought them there. This is Haifa, then, 20 years later. Noon, June 30, 1967. The car, a gray Fiat bearing white Jordanian license plates, was traveling north, across the plain, which was called Ibn Ammar 20 years ago. 2 It ascended the coastal road toward the southern entrance to Haifa. When the car crossed the road and entered the main street, all the walls came down and the road dissolved behind a film of tears. He heard himself say to his wife, "This is Haifa, Sophia." The steering wheel felt heavy between his palms, which had begun to sweat more profusely than they ever had before. It occurred to him to say to his wife, "I know this Haifa, but it refuses to acknowledge me." However, he changed his mind and after a moment a thought struck him, and he said to her, "You know, for 20 long years I always imagined that the Mandelbaum Gate would be opened someday, but I never imagined that it would be opened from the other side. It never entered my mind. So when they were the ones to open it, it seemed to me frightening and absurd and to a great degree humiliating. Maybe I'd be crazy if I told you that doors should always open from one side only, and that if they open from the other side they must still be considered closed. But nevertheless, that's the truth." He turned toward his wife, but she wasn't listening. She was turned away from him, absorbed in gazing at the road, now to the right, where the farmland stretched away as far as one could see, and now to the left, where the sea, which had remained so distant for more than 20 years, was raging near at hand. Suddenly she said. I never imagined that I would see Haifa again. He said. You're not seeing it. They're showing it to you. With that, Sophia's nerves failed her for the first time and she shouted. What's all this philosophy you've been spouting all day long? The gates and the sights and everything else. What happened to you? What happened to me? He said it to himself, trembling. But he took control of his nerves and continued to speak to her quietly. They opened the border as soon as they completed the occupation, suddenly and immediately. That has never happened in any war in history. You know the terrible thing that happened in April 1948, so now, why this? Just for our sakes. Alone, free no. This is part of the war. They're saying to us, help yourselves, look and see how much better we are than vous, how much more developed. You should accept being our servants. You should admire us. But you've seen it yourself. Nothing's changed. It was in our power to have done much better than Dev did. Then why did you come? He looked at her angrily and she fell silent. She knew. Why did she need to ask? She was the one who told him to come. For 20 long years she avoided talking about it, 20 years. Then the past erupted as though forced out by a volcano. As he drove the car through the center of Haifa, the smell of war was still strong enough to make the city seem to him dark and excited and agitated, the faces harsh and savage. After a little while he realized that he was driving the car through Haifa with the feeling that nothing in the streets had changed. He used to know Haifa stone by stone, intersection by intersection. How often he had crossed that road in his green 1946 Ford. Oh! He knew Haifa well, and now he felt as though he hadn't been away for 20 years. He was driving his car just as he used to. As though he hadn't been absent those 20 bitter years. The names began to rain down inside his head as though a great layer of dust had been shaken off them: Wadi Nisnas, King Faisal Street, Hanader Square, Halisa, Hadar 4. The events mixed together suddenly, but he held himself together and asked his wife in a barely audible voice. Well, where shall we begin? She was quiet. He heard her crying softly, almost silently. And he calculated to himself the suffering she was enduring. He knew he couldn't really comprehend that suffering precisely. But he did know it was very great, and that it had remained so for 20 years. Now it was welling up like some incredible monster inside of her, in her head, in her heart, in her memories. In her imagination, controlling her entire future. He was amazed that he had never thought about what that suffering must have meant to her, and about the extent to which it was buried in the wrinkles of her face and in her eyes and in her mind. It was with her in every bite of food she took and in every hut where she had lived and in every look she cast at her children and at him and at herself. Now all of it was bursting forth from the wreckage and the oblivion and the pain, to carry away the mass of bitter defeat he had tasted at least twice in his lifetime. All at once the past was upon him, sharp as a knife. He was turning his car at the end of King Faisal Street. For him, the street names had never changed, toward the intersection that descends left to the port and right to the road leading to Wadi Nisnas, when he saw a group of armed soldiers standing in front of an iron barricade at the intersection. As he watched them out of the corner of his eye, a sound like an explosion burst out from the distance. Then a crack of gunfire, and the steering Will began to tremble between his hands. He nearly ran up onto the sidewalk, but at the last moment he recovered himself and saw a young boy dashing across the road. With that scene the terrible past came back to him in all its tumultuousness. 4. The first time in 20 years he remembered what happened in minute detail, as though he were reliving it again. Morning, Wednesday, April 21, 1948. Haifa, the city, was not expecting anything, in spite of the fact that it was filled with dark tension. Thunder came abruptly from the east, from the heights of Mount Carmel. Mortar shells flew across the city's center, pelting the Arab quarters. The streets of Haifa turned into chaos. Alarm swept through the city as it closed its shops and the windows of its houses. Sedes was in the center of town when the sounds of shots and explosions started to fill the sky above Haifa. Up until noon, he hadn't expected that this would be the all-out attack, so it wasn't until then that he tried to return home in his car, but he soon discovered that this was impossible. He went down the side streets in an attempt to cross the road to Haifa, where he lived, but the fighting had already spread, and he saw armed men racing from side street to main road and from main road to side street. They moved in obedience to instructions blaring from loudspeakers placed here and there. After a while Said felt he was rushing helter-skelter, yet the alleyways, closed off by machine guns or bullets or the soldiers themselves, seemed to be pushing him unconsciously in one direction only. Over and over as he tried to return to his real direction, picking out a particular alley, he found himself pushed by an unseen force toward one road only, the road to the coast. He had married Sophia a year and 4 months before and had rented a house in a neighborhood he figured would be safe. But now he felt he wouldn't reach it. He knew his young wife wouldn't be able to cope. Ever since he had brought her from the country, she'd been unable to deal with city life or get used to all the complications which seemed to her terrifying and insoluble. What would happen to her now, he wondered. He was lost, nearly. He didn't know exactly where or how the fighting was taking place. As far as he knew, the British still controlled the city, and this whole situation should have taken place in approximately 3 weeks, when the British would begin to withdraw in accordance with the date they had fixed. As he quickened his pace he knew for certain that he had to avoid the high sections of town adjoining Hurst Street, where the Lus had been headquartered from the beginning. But he also had to stay away from the business district between Haifa and Allenby Street, for that was the Jews' strongest arms base. So he sped along, trying to circle around the business district in order to reach Haifa. Before him was the road that ends at Wadi Nisnas and passes through the old city. All of a sudden things got mixed up and the names became tangled up in his head: Haifa, Wadi Rushmiya, the Burj, the old city, Wadi Nisnas. 3 He felt completely lost, that he had even lost his sense of direction. The explosions intensified. Even though he was far enough away from the site of the shooting, he could still make out British soldiers who were boarding up some windows and opening others. Somehow he found himself in the old city, and from there he raced with a strength he didn't know he possessed toward South Stanton Street. And then he knew he was less than 200 meters away from Howell Street, and he began to catch the scent of the sea. At that exact moment he remembered little Kuldan, his son, who was 5 months old that very day, and a dark apprehension suddenly spread over him. It was the one taste that never left his tongue right up to this moment, 20 years after it happened for the first time. Had he expected that disaster? The events were mixed up. The past and present running together, both in turn jumbled up. With the thoughts and illusions and imaginings and feelings of 20 successive years. Had he known? Did he sense the calamity before it happened? Sometimes he told himself, yes, I knew it even before it happened. Other times he said, no, I only imagined it after it happened. I couldn't possibly have expected anything as horrifying as that. Evening began to settle over the city. He didn't know how. Many hours had passed as he rushed from street to street, but it was clear that he was being propelled toward the port. All the side streets leading off the main road were closed. He kept plunging down side streets trying to get to his house, but he was always driven back, sometimes by rifle muzzles, sometimes by bayonets. The sky was on fire, crackling with shots, bombs and explosions. Near and far. It was as though the very sounds themselves were pushing everyone toward the port. Even though he could not concentrate on anything specific, he couldn't help but see how the throng of people thickened with every step. People were pouring from the side streets into the main street leading down to the port, men, women and children, empty-handed. Or carrying a few small possessions, crying or being floated along in a paralyzed silence in the midst of the clamor and confusion. He was swallowed up in the rushing wave of humanity and lost the ability to direct his own steps. He kept remembering that he was being swept along by the dazed and crying throng toward the sea, unable to think about anything else. In his head was one picture only, suspended as though hanging on a wall, his wife Sophia and his son Kuldan. The moments passed slowly, relentlessly, making it seem like an incredibly severe nightmare. He went through the iron gate to the port where British soldiers were restraining people. From the gate he could see masses of people tumbling one over the other, falling into the small rowboats waiting near the wharf. 6 Without really knowing what he ought to do, he decided not to get into a rowboat. Then, like someone who suddenly goes insane or someone whose senses return all at once after a long period of insanity, he turned and began pushing through the throng with every ounce of strength he could muster, to forge a path through their midst, in the opposite direction, back toward the iron gate. Like someone swimming against a torrent of water plummeting down a lofty mountain, Said forged ahead, using his shoulders and forearms, his thighs, even his head. The current carried him a few steps backward, but he pushed on wildly like some hunted creature hopelessly trying to forge a path through a thick tangle of undergrowth. Above him the smoke and the wailing of bombs and hail of gunfire fused with the screams. The footsteps, the seas pounding, and the sound of oars slapping the surface of the waves. Could 20 years really have passed since then? Cold sweat poured down Seth's forehead as he drove the car up the slope. He hadn't counted on the memory coming back, full of the same insane turmoil that rightfully belonged only to the actual moments of the experience itself. He looked at his wife out of the corner of his eye. Her face was tense and pale, her eyes brimming with tears. Surely, he said to himself, she must be going back over her own steps that same day when he was as close as possible to the sea and she was as close as possible to the mountain, while between the two of them terror and destruction lengthened their unseen steps through the quagmire of screams and fear and uncertainty. She had, so she had told him more than once over the past years, been thinking about him. When the shots rang out and people burst out with the news that the English and the Jews had begun to overrun Haifa, a desperate fear came over her. She had been thinking about him when the sounds of war reached her from the center of town, for she knew he was there. She felt safe, so she remained in the house for a while. As his absence lengthened, she hurried out to the road without knowing exactly what she wanted to do there. At first she had looked out from the window, then from the balcony. Then she sensed that the situation had altered, for at noon fire began to pour down profusely from behind, from the hills above Haifa. She felt besieged all around, and only then did she dash down the steps and along the road toward the main street. The urgency of her desire to see him coming was a measure of her fear for him and her worry over the uncertain fate which carried 1,000 possibilities with every shot fired. When she reached the top of the road, she quickly began to search the cars filing by, her steps guiding her from car to car and from person to person, asking questions without receiving a single answer. Suddenly she found herself in the middle of a wave of people pushing her as they themselves were being pushed from all over the city in a massive, unstoppable, powerful stream. She was carried along like a twig of straw. How much time passed before she remembered that the infant Kaldun was still in his crib in Haifa? She didn't remember exactly, but she knew that some staggering force rooted her to the ground, while the endless flow of people streamed by her and around her as though she were a tree surrounded by a flood of rushing water. She turned back, resisting the flood with all her strength. Weak and exhausted, she began to shout with all her might, but her words failed to rise above the ceaseless clamor to reach any ear. She repeated 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times, Kaldun. Kaldun. 4 months her injured voice remained hoarse, barely audible. That name, Kaldun, was the one unchanging note floating wretchedly in the midst of that endless torrent of voices and names. She was on the verge of falling among the trampling feet, when she heard, as though in a dream, a voice well up out of the ground, calling her name. When she saw his face behind her, dripping with sweat, rage, oppression, she was more horrified than ever. Sorrow pierced her, swept over her, filled her with boundless determination, and she resolved to return, no matter what the price. Perhaps she felt that she would never again be able to look Said in the eye, or let him touch her. In the depths of her soul she felt she was about to lose them both, Said and Kaldun. She forged her way through, using all the strength in her arms, through the jungle blocking her return, trying at the same time to lose Said, who was alternately calling, Sophia. Kaldun. Did centuries pass, and destinies, before she felt his two strong, rigid hands fasten about her arms? Then she looked into his eyes and, paralyzed, collapsed against his shoulder like a worthless scrap of cloth. Around them passed the flood of humanity, pushing them from side to side, forcing them along toward the shore, but beyond that they were incapable of feeling anything at all until they were splashed by spray flying up from the oars, and they looked back toward shore to see Haifa clouding over behind the evening's dusk and the twilight of their tears.